Hey folks, Steve here with a special post-mortem video for the Dark Valley playthrough that I've been playing for 9 months now, something like that, pretty close. First things first, I should get out of the way. I got a message from Ted who had watched the videos, and I had created so many videos so fast, ordinarily there's an opportunity to get feedback from him, video to video sometimes if there's something he sees and he wants to correct an error or make a comment. But I spit out so many videos that, I made an assumption, or I read the rules and I interpreted them incorrectly, and Ted had to point it out, and I think it's important that I explain it to you, and the good thing is the rules mistake ultimately would not have mattered, but it is important in case you're playing the game to know this. So in the waning turns there, I had this big pocket of Axis units that were out of supply because they couldn't trace to they couldn't trace out of the port basically for a line of supply, but Ted was saying that they are marked out of supply, not isolated, and I might have to write back to Ted on this now that I'm thinking about it, because here's the thing, right? When we talk about the supply rules in this game, it said you are isolated if you can't trace a line of communication to a supply source. And a line of communication is a contiguous path of hexes, and they can't cross lake or sea hex sides. So I don't know. That Ted said in a message that these guys were out of supply, not isolated, but I believe that the rules state that they would be isolated based on our understanding of a line of communication, that they cannot cross a sea hex side, and that the rules state that if if you can't use that supply port, that you're marked out of supply instead of in supply. That's what the rule book says. So I don't know. I'm going to reach back out to Ted on this, and maybe during a review video or something, or maybe if I get an answer before I finish formatting this video, I'll share that out in the video. So anyway, point being, at least according to Ted, and Ted is the designer, so whether or not the rules are clear on the situation, the idea was these guys were just out of supply, not isolated, which means any units removed via isolation technically should not have been. But the reality was I had taken Danzig by force, or at least I think I took it by force, or I definitely could have before the end of the turn, and I would have been able to take Königsberg as well with the turns remaining, right? We did turn 43, and I basically just whiffed and talked about what turn 44 would have looked like. I could have had multiple combats there and would have likely taken the city no matter what. So, not a big deal there. We still, no matter what, we would have ended with a Soviet victory, with one victory point being held by the Axis at the end of the game. Might have been determined on turn 44 instead of turn 43, but ultimately, I don't think that changes the game very much. So, yeah, something to point out, something I wanted to throw out there as commentary. I'm going to reach out to Ted on that one and try to get some answer from him. I'm going to put a cut here. In fact, I'll probably put a couple of cuts through this post-mortem video because my brain's kind of going in a lot of different places in terms of reflection of how the game went. I want to make sure that I have my thoughts a little bit collected before I speak to them on camera. So I'm going to put a cut here, and we'll be back. Okay, I'm back. I didn't reach out to Ted. If he watches this video, I had just written up an email, and as I'm looking at the rules and I'm quoting rule sections, it dawns on me why this is the case, that these guys would have been out of supply rather than isolated. So I'm going to restate it here for others just so that folks understand, because this might be very relevant for forces that you have, whether they're Soviet or German, that are trapped on the coast somewhere and encircled. At least for the Axis, this is what the rules say, right? That that ports can be supply sources, right? They become Axis supply sources, right? If the enemy controls a port, further along from your port, ordinarily that would be, what I was thinking, I guess is one way to say it, right? I was thinking, okay, well, if the ports are there and lines of communications can't cross sea hex sides, then, you can't trace a line of communication back to a supply source. And so they're isolated, right? The rules say that you're isolated if you can't trace a line of communication. You can't trace a line of communication across sea hex sides, thus all those units were isolated, right? That was what I was thinking to be the case. However, upon reading the rules with a fine-tooth comb and making sure, busting out my lawyer brain, that I'm not a lawyer, but, I'm going to use that part of my brain that could be a lawyer, and say, okay, what is the fundamental meaning here? Well, the trick to this is that the ports are said to be supply sources. So by virtue of this big pocket here in Prussia, of those units being able to trace to a port, even if that port can't provide actual supply because of the enemy-controlled port down the way, that port is still technically a supply source. And so those units can trace a line of communication to those ports, I think, is how that needs to be interpreted. If what Ted is saying, if I'm interpreting this correctly, right? I don't think the rules are very clear on this, right? It kind of makes me wonder, I don't know how often it comes up for folks, but just that level of I don't know. We're in the area of hazy rules that are kind of hard for me to parse, because some of it's very circumstantial, right? You might not have a pocket like this up against the sea, and so it might not really matter. But I guess the takeaway here is, if you end up with my camera screwed up as it does, so to reiterate, I'm not sure where I lost it. If your units are in a bubble, surrounded, but they can trace to a port, they are out of supply, assuming an enemy has a port, further along. They are out of supply. They are not isolated because the ports themselves are supply sources that those units can trace to. I think that's the right interpretation. If you look at the rules and you read the rules very carefully, but the rules don't really spell it out for you, I think, as clearly as they could. This is like a clarification kind of thing, where I'm making a leap, but I think I made a leap in my rules interpretation, but I don't think I was I don't think it was like totally out of this world to have made that assumption, as incorrect as it may have been. So yeah, so looking at the rules, I think what Ted was saying is correct, that they would have been out of supply. The rules seem to support that, but again, maybe one line in there saying, by the way, this means that blah, blah, blah would be helpful, because, that could have, it didn't here, but for someone else's game, that could be a real game changer, whether or not you're interpreting that rule correctly. And I guess for some folks, this just might be common sense, right? If you're backed up into Königsberg like that, right? You're not isolated necessarily. You have access to the sea. You still have a port. Guys can get on boats. It's just that I guess the problem being but they're not isolated because they can get on boats, they can leave, whatever, and that there are ports off map here over across the Kiel Canal that I mean there's communication with the homeland, right? They're not totally cut off, I guess. So the rules around lines of communication and ports, you just have to look at very carefully. So, okay, I think I'm done with that ramble because I think it was important to point this out. And the first 5 minutes of this video are all dedicated to that that rules supply issue and question. Again, it didn't affect my game, but I think it's really important to point out. So I'm going to put a cut here, and then we'll come back and talk. Okay, now that we got that rules coverage done and my misinterpretation addressed, let's talk about the game. Let's talk about the playthrough, right? I want to save my thoughts on the game as a product for the review. That will be forthcoming. I'm not exactly sure when that will come up because what I want to do is get in front of the camera, change the angle where the camera and the game is set up, because I'm going to have to clean this up. I've got whole piles of counters and everything else strewn about. I want to get it kind of cleaned up. I want to move the maps over to another table and then hop on camera and really talk through the review. So this is really just going to be my reflections, a post-mortem of the game as I played it, and how I thought I did, and the feel of the scenarios that I played through. Let me start off with the Operation Bagration, since that's the most fresh in my mind. That's what we played. I will say that it felt satisfactorily different from other game stages that we had been in. That feeling of the Axis sort of crumbling was felt for sure, and that press for time, because there was historically, yes, a press for time. The Soviets needed and wanted to get into as much of Europe as they could before the Western Allies could. That feeling was there. And gosh, we were spending Soviet manpower to do it, right? But there's always more. So I do think that this particular scenario, it is fun and it was challenging. The thing about it was, I got to play to the end. I guess if you were just playing the Bagration. We're talking about Operation Bagration, not Barbarossa. If I had just played that scenario, right, from turn 34 to 38, could that be a hard scenario for the Soviets? Maybe. I think having to get the Axis down to 12 victory points. You can maybe get the Romanian ones. You maybe aren't getting Hungary, and then maybe, I don't know. It just depends, right? You're going to be playing around in here and seeing if you can meet the requirement. But it was fun. It was interesting to see that play out. I think the really key thing was having artillery massed and firing every opportunity. Even sometimes you miss and they have to flip to their done side of the artillery marker. But most of the time, I mean, you have pretty good odds to roll and to keep rolling. And so I think for sure, even in the previous turns, when that artillery started coming on the board, it was like, you wanted to get those guys on there. You wanted to get them, one in each hex along a broad front. You wanted the HQs nearby, and that was a great focal point for activity. And that is what helped us bust through our line here to get up, sort of this way. And ultimately, it was sort of that breakthrough that allowed us to win the game by cutting the Axis in half there up there in the north and causing grief. It was kind of interesting that, in some ways, the reverse was happening with the Soviets, where like terrain really became a problem. Getting through the Carpathians slowed things down. Even getting through these marshes and woods slowed down our fast-moving mechanized units, and that was part of the challenge. Was what's faster? Am I going to try to drive through the swamp, or am I going around and where can I get? No, there's a lake here. I'm going to have to go around the lake. So all that kind of played into things and factored in. I think the thing that I guess the thing that follows the game, and I guess if you were to look at the action chit schedule, I think on the turns where there is not, like, okay, I'll look at, December, February 42, right? Each side has mover combat. Well, any time that there's these schedules where one side can move and the other side can move without extra chits allowing for extra moves, right, or extra combat moves, as the case may be, either deep battle or the Panzer HQs, you do have this possibility that one side is going to retreat one hex all along the line with a big grand move, and it's like move counter move, and if you have that move counter move, I mean, there are enough hexes across the map, right? It rushes deep, right? There's a lot of space to play with. You can just keep doing that, and I think we had seen several times. I think from my Case Blue start that you could do that a lot. You could do that as the Soviets if you're on the defense. You could do that as the Axis if you're on the defense. And we sort of saw that as the Axis had maintained their line. Now, I didn't have a lot of major crazy losses for the Axis in that Case Blue play segment. But I was able to really make use of that retreat one hex, and I think, the Soviets just had a really hard time, catching them, right? It's to the point where I had to reset the map for Operation Bagration because I don't think there was anything that the Soviets could do to really catch up, right? If they get an extra combat chit, say it's like, Soviet move, then the Axis move, and then the next two chits are Soviet combat and then combat, Stavka Zhukov. Well, as good as those combats are, as great as that would be, they're just completely, they're made completely irrelevant by the move. It's like a wasted turn, right? So in scenarios where it's a shorter number of turns, I could see a challenge where it's like, hey, if you get a couple of those whiff turns where nothing happens because of the move counter move, you're losing like 20% of the game right there or something like that, right? Or 15%. Of the game, it's just that. There you go. 15% of the turn, or 15% of the action is wasted on a move counter move. Now, there's something to be said where, like, yeah, that should be allowed, right, to a certain degree. It's just you're really looking at that luck factor of the chits. So I know some people are concerned with the game about, is the game scripted? I don't know that the game is scripted, right? I think that what the chits are representing, and I'll talk about this in my review as well, just because I want to make sure folks aren't scared away by the game because of the chits. It's like it's not scripted. The chits are reflecting things that are outside this theater constraints and things that you can't control. So yeah, those things are scripted because there's nothing you can do to change it, right? You can't change the weather. You can't change the fact that the Allies are going to invade Normandy, right? That's outside this game's scope. So everything outside the scope of the game that you can't change because it's not a grand strategic level game, right? This is basically an operational game. Even if it's strategic sort of in some ways, almost strategic level, and you're making big strategic decisions about where you're going, where you're attacking, it is an operational game. So you're not making decisions of, I'm gonna make a whole bunch of winter coats for all of my Wehrmacht. Like you're not making that decision, right? And so the chits are reflecting these things, these historical constraints that you ultimately have to operate in because you, as the commander of all these forces, you don't have a choice over. You don't get a say, and so that is what you have to operate in. What can be a bummer with the chits, of course, is what I was just saying, where the order of the chits, which do come down to luck. It's a war game. There's luck. Every time you roll the dice, there's luck. Every time you pull a chit, there's luck. But sometimes it can feel like that luck can be devastating and can have very profound effects on the game because of that order, right? And to me, it's really the move-counter move. I mean, other war games that have a standard or sequence of play, it's like, okay, move and combat, or combat and move, like in Thunder in the East. where you're guaranteed that there is some fighting going on. But these move-counter moves basically can create a case where in a month, there's not a whole lot of action happening at all. And I realize there are circumstances even in history where these forces were pulling back and they were slipping away and pulling back and being chased out of certain regions. I realize that's the case. It's just, I don't know. It's kind of hard to judge. Was it a true negative impact? It ended up not mattering for the Soviets, and I'm very glad that as the Soviets in Operation Bagration, I won as an offensive side, right? Because the game has it where the beginning axis is on offense, in the middle it's still kind of the axis on offense, but the Soviets can hit back, and then it's the Soviets on offense, right? And what I've been worried about as I played through was, is the game too hard for offensive powers, or the offensive side? I have definitely felt like the challenge is there. So if you're going to sit down and play this game, the more experienced player probably should be the offensive player, because they really have to do so well to succeed, it seems like. And of course, as I got better playing the game over 40 turns, I was able to do offensive things better as the Soviets, but the Soviets get a lot of help. They're expected to trounce the ever-weakening Axis who stops getting reinforcements, right? So it's kind of hard to judge that, and that move-counter move has a direct impact on the offensive player. So I don't know. For me, it's kind of hard to compartmentalize my thoughts on it, because in some cases maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe it's just luck, right? Like if you average it out, it won't be move counter move every time. There's going to be other chits. There's going to be other things going on. I didn't do deep percentage chance statistics every turn to figure out what I was going to draw. The move counter move kind of thing. But if you did that every turn, you just try to moneyball it, maybe you can find your way around that problem. I think there were cases in the mid game that, I think maybe Ted pointed out, maybe I should have played a different chit than move on some turns. My inexperience with, this being my first playthrough, maybe I couldn't see the right strategy, and that is something that has probably colored this entire playthrough. Is I've learned the game as I've gone. And what I learn for certain parts of the game may not be as relevant for other parts of the game, right? The lessons I learned in Operation Barbarossa, advancing the HQs and realizing I wasn't advancing fast enough, or I wasn't clearing, not clearing Riga really hurt me, even though I tried to get through Riga. It took an extra turn. That really slowed me down. That kind of stuff didn't necessarily help me, as the Soviets in Operation Bagration, other than maybe, me keeping in mind, hey, I want to clear some of these rail lines so I can rail move units further ahead to reposition them, right? So marginal, lessons learned taken throughout the game as I'm playing each side and figuring things out. So it's just one of those things. You got to figure out, you're going to get better at the game, I guess, if you play this more than once. If you played opposed, you're going to get more experience with it. You're going to understand the better plays. I have to admit that throughout the game, whatever stumbling mistakes I've made, maybe they weren't all super bad, but I've certainly made some, right? Like I think I've certainly made mistakes. I've certainly done things that, if I were to go through the game again, I would do differently. I would do better. I would probably be a better offensive player across the board. But my fear for others who are watching this game or thinking about getting the game is they're gonna hear what I'm saying and be really turned off of the game, and that's not my intention to say that. I think this is a game that is worth the time to really, you want to learn the game, you want to learn the systems, you want to know how to operate the game, and the first time you play as an offensive player could be very frustrating because you haven't learned how to play the game the right way, right? There are some games, your Panzer Push or World War II games, where the strength of the Axis units can kind of get you pretty far, right? And that's a game maybe like Unconditional Surrender, where the Germans just get net, +2 to every die roll or whatever, and that is just going to get them wherever they want to go for a long time in that game. Here, because it's much more zoomed in, much more operational, a lot more, factors matter when you're moving units around. Like, you really need to be thinking through the attack. It's not going to happen for you. Barbarossa is not going to succeed for you. You need to make Barbarossa succeed as the Axis, right? You need to actually, conduct your attacks. You need to plan your moves. You need to figure things out. And it would probably be, especially for Barbarossa, even slower than I played Barbarossa, ideally, because you really want to be thinking about where you're going. Later turns where some of that maybe doesn't matter as much, you can play more swiftly. But for something like Barbarossa, for sure, you need to really be planning this stuff. And I think that's good. That's in an operational game, that's kind of the whole point of the game, right? This clip is going for 15 minutes. I'm going to put a cut here, and I'm going to let a couple other thoughts bubble up in my brain, and we'll keep the discussion going. Okay, so I'm coming back. Something that I really appreciate about the game, in my experience of having played it now, is it. And I want to make sure I say this the right way, because I really don't want it to be misunderstood, and it might be easy to do so. What's nice about the game is that it does have the distinct phases, that those phases feel very different to one another, and they have mechanics or rules to govern those differences in a way that makes sense and is pretty easy to parse, all things considered, right? So if you were one of those awesome people who've watched every video up to this point, you will have had watched my struggles and frustration as the Germans doing Barbarossa, and as I just said a few minutes ago, that there is a high bar for Barbarossa. You really have to figure out how you're going to succeed if you're going to do as well as they did historically, or if you're going to try to do even better and win an automatic game victory, which is pretty tough to do. And if you're a competent defensive player, you're probably going to keep that automatic victory from happening no matter what. But hey, the chance is there, so the Axis might go for it. And a lot of what makes that interesting is, there are special rules for Barbarossa, a lot of special rules that you need to keep in mind during those first 8 turns. That can be a bit of a pain to look after and make sure you're following. But, you still have the other mechanics, like the mandated counterattacks on the Soviet side that, are there so that you still get the East Front War as it happened, right? If you didn't have to do those mandated offensives, you could shuffle the Soviets around and sort of have this unfair advantage, but they're it's one of those things. Like, are the Stalin's mandated counteroffensives to a scripted component of the game? Maybe, but they're kind of needed. Like, it needs to be there for the game to still make sense historically, right? And I think it does it in a way that makes sense, and it makes the game feel different than later aspects of the game, right? So to return to my main point here, Operation Barbarossa felt a certain way, right? The things that I'm doing with the HQs and flinging the panzers forward and creating encirclements and getting up, through the tough terrain, trying to get to Moscow, the struggle to get up there, that had a distinct feel within the game. When I restacked the counters to do Case Blue, that felt different, right? It became a little bit more maybe to the familiar eye of a hex and counter game, where you're looking at, trying to get 3 hexes attacking 1 hex and figuring out the combat factors and shuffling units and finding the right place to attack and lend support, and looking to create breakthroughs, which we did, right? We had a really interesting encirclement around Voronezh over here, in Tula, so I guess it's really over here. And that was pretty interesting. It was pretty fun, trying to figure out that whole situation and scrambling as the Soviets to contain it. And that was different, right? Because it wasn't like, the Axis is blowing holes through the Soviets anymore. It was more like if they're breaking through in certain points, and the Soviet has to play smart to try to contain it. That in itself was a game experience. And I still had, as the Axis, the choice. I wasn't scripted in attacking Stalingrad. I chose to not do so, but I knew I was playing past, the scenario stopping point. If we were playing just Case Blue, and I have an incentive that if I don't reach the victory point threshold, I'm going to lose anyway, then yeah, maybe I would have tried harder to get into Stalingrad. It's that kind of thing where I guess you're playing to the objective, but I found the Case Blue on the way through maybe like turn 27 to be really interesting, like 2 years of gameplay or whatever it ends up being, a year and a half of gameplay, because that's that midpoint of the year where it's move, attack, counterattack, maneuvering, fast reaction, sending mobile forces, mechanized forces through the steppe. That was pretty interesting. And then, when we finally got to Operation Bagration, it was, sort of a reverse Barbarossa, but still it was different, right? I mean, you're thinking about it differently. You're trying to wear out the Axis and cause a breakthrough, rather than where what the Germans were doing to the Soviets was just kicking in the door somewhere and creating an encirclement where, even as the Soviets, we weren't necessarily encircling a whole lot of guys. We were just, mowing them down to the point of breaking, and then we were encircling them. Sort of different. That sounds the same, but there is a nuance there. There is a difference, and the game portrays that pretty well, I think. And, the maneuvers into Romania and Hungary were interesting and felt kind of different. And what's nice is, right, if you're buying a game that is like the East Front 41, 45, it ought to be able to give you a pretty interesting experience through each phase of the war. And I did feel that, like, thinking 9 months ago going through Barbarossa, or 8 months ago, whatever, going through Barbarossa, it's like, oh man, it's the same map, right? It's the same game I've had up for this long. But it felt like a different game a little bit, right? It is the game. It is the same game, right? It absolutely is. But what it was interesting is that it is a different experience. I got a different experience playing Bagration than I did playing Barbarossa, and I think that's really important and valuable for the game and for the game experience. Like, having gone through all of this, right? This mammoth effort, I can say I wasn't sitting here playing the exact same game experience for 8 months. It was, for a few months I got through Barbarossa. That was interesting. We did Case Blue. That was cool. I was doing very well as the Axis at that point. We said, let's just reset and do Bagration. And that was interesting for the last couple of months. I've been entertained by what the game has offered and what I've experienced in the gameplay, which I think is very cool. I think that, in my play, the challenge is if you're playing that grand campaign, or you're picking a scenario start and you're going to play to the end, you're really factoring in that, like, you can play a long game. If you're going to play the long game, you can play a long game. What I mean by that is, like with Case Blue, right, I wasn't playing the short scenario. So all of my decisions were based on a long game. I'm going to win in the long run by doing X, Y, Z, right? And that was not pushing too hard for the Caucasus, not pushing too hard for Stalingrad. I pushed for where I could push, which was Voronezh and Orel, and I managed to get the victory points I needed to keep playing the game. That was my camera screwed up. I don't know why it does that. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it does. Again, what I'm saying is, as the Axis in Case Blue, because I wasn't doing the short campaign, I was doing the long campaign, the full campaign. Ideally, that was the idea, right? From starting from turn 12. I didn't go for the Caucasus. I didn't go for Stalingrad. Now that option was a little more free to me by playing the long game. I didn't have a deadline by the scenario ending and me losing because I didn't have enough victory points. So I could make that longer term choice of, I'm not going to overextend myself. I pushed into the areas I needed to push into, but I reached the threshold the game required me to hit. I'm not going to push any harder than that. I'm gonna strap in and hold on. And that ended up proving to be very effective as the Axis, because I did not suffer catastrophic losses, because I could keep my losses After that, relatively tame. Um, I didn't. I had a really strong Axis line, and if you remember, it was like from, Leningrad on the way down through to like here, and we were still in eastern Ukraine when we stopped, when we called it, because we were getting to Bagration, and it was like, you know the Axis is too strong. I played very well as the Axis in that sort of strategic thinking, and saying, I've made plenty of gains, and now I'm going to maybe go against what Hitler would have wanted, and I'm going to put in my defense and hold it, and that proved effective. And as the Soviets, you're kind of waiting for your army to get better. And by the time we were really good, I think I had just mismanaged where I was concentrating forces. I do think if I were replaying the game, and if I had if I had planned ahead a little bit better in terms of where I was going to put my guard tank armies and my guard infantry armies, I could have maybe still broken that really good Axis line. I think it's feasible, but I probably would have needed to do it before the Axis got backed up into the major river here, where they had defensive advantage behind the river line. So, I don't want to say I don't think it was the perfect strategy what I did with the Germans. I think the Soviets still could have done something better in 43 to stop that Axis strategy, or to try to overcome it. But I don't think I quite had the planning beforehand to address it. And I think ultimately a failing of mine was that early on, when the Guard armies started coming on, I would put them a little bit here, a little bit there. And that maybe is even the historical way that they were deployed. I have to go look at my book. But I think the ideal thing to do is really to set them all up in one place. Pick your place, wherever you want it to be, and let that be where they all concentrate. And if you have two 14 strength armies in a hex, and you throw in a couple of corps, you're looking at 30 plus combat power in a hex. You do that in 2 to 3 hexes, you're talking about 90 combat power. And what might be defending there is maybe, if they put a lot of infantry corps there, maybe like 20 some, right? So 90 to 20, that's still pretty good odds, right? That's still possibly 4-to-1 odds. And you could get an EX result, right? And blow out those units. Now, that might blunt your spear as the Soviets, and you have to rebuild those units, but the Soviets can better handle that than probably the Axis, right? So that's probably one thing I would need to fix. Really appreciating, again, the artillery and the HQs. The learning experience had an impact on the game for sure, in terms of balance and who was winning and who could win, and when I had to reset, why did I have to reset. I've got some more thoughts. I'm going to put a cut here just to make sure I can articulate it, so I'll be right back. Okay, let's talk more. Some more commentary here, situated a little more centered, so that we can talk about the whole game. One of the other things that I think was good for me to do was to use these bingo chits as markers for the victory point cities. Now, the cities have the little red circle with them denoting them as victory cities. You can see, I'll have to zoom in real hard on Vinitsa here. You can see, okay, it's victory point hex. The only problem is, it is very easy for this stuff to get covered up by huge stacks of units, right? Like, there's a whole mess of units over here. If there was a victory point hex there, you'd have to dig through just to double check, right, if you didn't have it memorized. And I guess you could print out maybe like a black and white, printing of the map from online, and you could use a pen and circle, where all the victory point cities are, and count that way. But I just found it easier to use the bingo chits because they stick out a little bit. You can kind of see them in between the stacks of counters for the most part. and it's much easier at a glance to count, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever, what victory point cities are controlled by whom. I use blue for the Axis, red for the Soviets. And, these are really great. I've had them for a while. I've used them. Red and blue, the eternal battling colors. But just getting these, I think I paid a couple bucks for a big bag of them. I use them for other games as well. It's easy to use them for markers that maybe, you want to put down that aren't game-specific, markers for a purpose. But here it just helps for things to pop, things like victory point hexes, which just tend to be more important. So it worked out well. The actual tokens are a little bit bigger than the hexes they're sitting on top of, so things could get a little messy or congested with some of the counters, but it worked pretty well, so I'm glad I did that. I will say that if you're going to play this game, it is very important you use forceps and tweezers. So I did use, I had some that I used. I just got these recently. These are really good forceps. I've used them recently. They do a good job because it's important you have precision when picking up these units, because they're not very big, right? Now the niceness of the thick counters in this deluxe edition kind of helps, with your ability to grab them and pick them up and move them around. And if you don't clip the counters, they actually, will stick together pretty well and easy to handle. So I wouldn't recommend rounding the corners of these necessarily. I think they work good with the corners still on them because of the thickness of the counter. But when you're in situations like over here, where there's just like, you can see, there's stuff knocked over because I've been kind of careless, but just moving everything around, all these stacks of guys, the game doesn't have huge stacks, but even 4 counters, which is like the max combat stacking, is enough that if you're to try to pick that up with your fingers, a lot of the time, if there's a lot of other units in the area, you're going to knock stuff over. You're going to accidentally flip counters, you're going to knock them over, you're going to move them out of place, and you really don't want to have to do that. And I really recommend using forceps and tweezers. Some people would already be using them, but if you're one of the kinds of folks who's like, my fingers are fine, I got fingernails or whatever, I wouldn't recommend it. You're gonna find yourself in a bit of frustration. And some of this is, you got to realize that, there are other games like Thunder in the East, right? Covers basically more or less the same amount of land in Russia, Eastern Europe. It's a lot. It's a lot to cover, right? Russia's big, and Eastern Europe's big with it. Thunder in the East has a bigger map. And part of the reason why it has a bigger map is that the hexes are bigger, the units are bigger, and you can pick those counters up in that game a little bit easier because everything's just bigger, right? But the cost is you have a bigger table space to deal with. Here, it's 2 normal-sized maps put together. And so to account for all of this space and at the scale that we're dealing with here, the counters and the hexes are a little bit smaller. And again, it is, you need precision here to move the things that you need to move. In the early game, in like Barbarossa, where all the units are kind of spread out and they're moving all around, maybe not as big of a deal. But once you start getting into like Case Blue, where there's a coherent line, and you're moving things around the line and out of the line and moving units to and fro, you're really going to need to make sure you have the precision there. So, definitely, seeing how many counters there are in general, right? Just so many over here. I've got the Axis dead pile on another table because it just got so massive. Like, there's a lot of counters to deal with overall, and you want to make sure that you can find what you're looking for. If you want to get to that bottom unit of a stack, you got to pick each unit up and kind of move them out of the way to read and count up combat factors. Much easier with forceps or tweezers. Something else that I really appreciated, having played from Barbarossa to the end, is that I did get a good sense and appreciation of how the armies of the major sides, Axis and Soviet, changed as they did historically. So, or at least the operational, the mechanical simulation of the size matches what I know of history. And I'm not an expert, for sure. And what I have read and the books that I've read and things that I've watched, the game matches my expectations. So, you have the Axis, which Starts the game very competent. All their units have pretty decent combat strength. Their infantry's great on defense. You've got your panzer divisions, which are great, and they're doing their thing. And in the early phases of the game, when the Soviets only have their one combat strength divisions, yeah, they're getting mauled, right? And even stacks of three, what would be the equivalent of an army but not formed as an army organization, are getting ripped apart. Even the early Soviet 41 mech units are getting ripped apart most of the time, and that all felt pretty accurate in terms of what you have on the board and what you can do with them. And of course, over the length of the war, the Axis force doesn't really change that much. By the end of the game, you've got these nice decent strength divisions that are coming in. You start getting some of these battalions that are really great for combat and stacking, together. That's all well and good, but the Axis force doesn't dramatically change over the course of the game. And in fact, the number of counters that you have on the map, until they start disintegrating in the late part of the war, you're kind of dealing with the same set of units. I mean, replacements will bring them back on the board if they're eliminated, but your force pool is basically the same for much of the war, other than those newer reinforcement units that come in, and then eventually start to become reliant on reinforcements of these little dinky, 2-4 Axis divisions as well. But what you have is what you have, basically. So as the Axis player, you're working with what you got. You don't have a lot of manpower, which is translated to the reinforcement schedule. So losses for you are not great. You can take some, and even in the later parts of the war where you get those regular reinforcements, they're really important and they're really nice to have. But you can't spend blood willy-nilly, and what you're really forced to do, and I sort of mentioned this in an earlier clip, right? In the early phases, you're looking to not overrun the Soviets across the board, but you're looking to break through the line in a couple of places, and you're strong enough defensively to hold an encirclement, and that's how you eliminate units. And this is obvious stuff, right, for a World War II East Front game, but the game does do that well, and I got a good feeling for that. And even in the late stages of the game, right, it's then conserving as much of your manpower as possible and doing your best to defend with what you've got. And from that point, you're going from what has been a stagnant force pool, or roughly the same number of units, the same units on the board, they are slowly just disappearing on the map, and things are being destroyed. And if you compare that then with the Soviet, I think this is one of the best parts of the game, really, or what I thought was really neat to see over the long term, from turn to turn, from scenario to scenario, is that if there's a protagonist here, it's certainly the Soviet army, because you go from, and the game really does allows you to see the evolution, and I've gotten to see that evolution over the course of the game. You're reliant on the 1-4 crap units. You start getting army, units organized as armies, the 5-4s with Zocs, and even their presence on the field is very important. Just having Zocs at all tends to make a big difference. You see those 41 mech kind of being useful, but not to their full potential. They're not doing everything you need them to really be doing. And, that starts to work. You start to become competent at combat with some of these units over time, replacing others. And then, you just start to get those inklings of the guard units, right? The guard corps start coming on, and it's not a big deal, right? You're basically getting rid of 3 1-factor units to get 1 4-factor unit, which is actually an increase of 1 combat power, right? That's cool. You start seeing those guys, the red starts showing up on the map, and then, you start to get some of the guard tank corps on, and they're a little bit better than your normal tank corps. Gosh, I'm even skipping ahead, right? There's a whole point where let me find it. I think I set it aside, and I'm not sure what I did with it. Shoot, what did I do with it? Dang. Here they are. They're like buried. I should say, like, after the mech are removed, the Soviets get these little tank brigade markers, right? And they're useful, right? The introduction of mechanized, the reorganization of the Soviet mechanized warfare capability. To then you start to see the tank corps come out, and the tank corps are useful, and those fast movers help them plug places, and they're supportive. And so you start getting those guard infantry corps, they're useful. You start getting your tank corps, then you get the guard tank corps, and they're a little bit better. And then you start to get, and I guess you get guard cavalry, but I don't know. I found guard cavalry to be very useful. I really like the guard cavalry because they have fast movement, but they're not mechanized, so they can actually get across some places like marshes and woods a little more swiftly than the mechanized forces, which I found to be useful in Operation Bagration sometimes. I just needed to get guys through a hole, and the cavalry ended up being sometimes more useful than the armor. But then you start getting the real heavy hitters, right? You start getting the guard tank armies and the guard infantry armies, right? And what's interesting is that they come on the board, you've got to remove other units, right? So you got to, you're going to reform some of these infantry armies. And what's interesting is you actually, lose some combat factor, right? If it's like 3-5-4 armies, you would think it'd be 15 combat factors, but it's only 14 on the guard conversion. But the important thing is the stacking, because now you're putting 14 combat factors for one stacking point, essentially, or one army's worth of a stacking point in your hex. And that becomes important. You can concentrate greater firepower in one place. And then, of course, the guard tank armies, similarly are bringing a lot of force to bear, and they're going to be really great at breaking through. And what I found really interesting, of course, was like replacing an infantry army is expensive. Topping off a slightly beat up guard tank army is actually cheaper than I even thought it was. I made a mistake playing. I thought I had to replace them on the cost of a combat factor for these guys, but it's not. You actually replace them based on static values in the rulebook, and they're cheaper. So you kind of want to use, it's kind of double-edged sword, but the guard tank armies you want to be using maybe to take a loss in a combat, but then really you want those guys to be the ones to advance after combat and then move, if you're doing deep battle, to penetrate deeper into the enemy line. And I'm not sure I've determined, what is the optimal choice in all those kinds of combats, but it's just really cool is that, that evolution, again, it's just very neat. It's just very cool that the game was able to really portray, and you're involved in the deployment of these new Soviet forces, and the fact that the doctrine of the Soviets changes with the chit pool over time. The officer corps is reinforced, and they're able to begin offensive operations. I was reading my Cataclysm book along with at the same time, and it sort of talked to that a little bit as I was going, and I was seeing it. I was seeing it in the chit recipes. I was seeing it in the forces. Sometimes it was the doctrine was lagging behind the forces on the board, which was historical based on my reading, and I just thought that was really neat. I mean that somehow helped the narrative experience that I was having. That seeing the Soviets being sort of pushed to the brink, seeing how far the Axis got, but then knowing that all these reinforcements, that's going to be a big deal, and that there's new forces coming on the board. And when you really look at it, right, I mentioned for the Axis, you're talking about the same force pool on the map for most of the game. The Soviets, by comparison, had really one sort of force pool at the beginning and a very different force pool at the end. And we even had turns where we were topped off on reinforcements. We couldn't reinforce anymore. We had wasted replacement points because I keep mixing up reinforcement and replacement, but I think you know what I mean. The replacing of units and putting them back on the board and pulling up the full strength. Sometimes I had more points than I could spend because, the operational, logistical model of the Soviet Army, we had, our manpower was just doing great, right? There was, we had them, more men than we knew what to do with, essentially. Then we could get on trains to the front to join up with the armies, or the army only had so much equipment. Maybe that's the limiting factor, right? Even if you have 20 unspent reinforcement points, they can't be put on the board because you're out of counters, you're out of units that are in the force pool, and that's ultimately your limit on equipment. So, like compared to Thunder in the East, where they do put sort of a very um, non-abstract or a more direct resource counter on like equipment points and manpower points, and different points on the map represent equipment and manpower. I found in just looking at the game and trying to assess what I'm seeing and what I'm playing, I think the Dark Valley has that as well, right? It's the force pool. What is available to even be on the map at any given point is a restriction of equipment. Your reinforcement points and your reinforcements and your replacement points are a function of manpower. And it's interesting. Like oil doesn't have a huge impact on this game. There is the incentive to take the oil fields in the southeast corner of the map, the Caucasus victory condition down here, and that's sort of abstract. There are the oil hexes over here that allow the Axis to continue to have air units and serve as victory points in the late game. I didn't really account for that in my playthrough, but I figured they were going to lose the oil anyway. There's a reason to protect the oil as the Axis, but it never really felt like that was a huge component of it, probably because oil ultimately is a strategic level concern, less than an operational level concern, but there is an element there. The only thing I would, I guess I'm sitting there wondering is, well, if I had taken all the oil and now the Axis can't use air, should there have been any sort of restriction on mechanized units? But you could chalk that up to the synthetic oil in Germany. I don't know. I'm not going to worry too much about it, but I do feel like, those elements that should matter, like oil, like manpower, like equipment, and manufacturing, I think those are represented here in a satisfactory way. Like it's not being an operational game, not a strategic game. It shouldn't sit on those points too much. But I think it gives you, it's operational. It gives you incentives on a strategic level thinking to do things, right? Like you take the industrial centers, you take Kiev, you take Leningrad, you take Stalingrad, because they have these sources of replacement points. And if you can deprive the Soviets of that, that can slow them down. You still have that incentive. There are the incentives of, do I dive down here? Do I try to shoot up this way? The map is kind of configured where, there's potentially some incentive. There's a reason as the Axis to overstretch yourself, maybe, because you might be able to do the knockout blow. It's not likely, but it's there, and it needs to be there for the players to try it. So I think how all that mixes together, it feels pretty good. So as a post-mortem conclusion, I guess, because I don't want to, this video is probably way longer than I meant it to be as a post-mortem. I'd say I've genuinely had some fun with the game. I have had fun with it, absolutely. I think the game does what it needs to do in terms of portraying the East Front, as best that I understand it. Again, I am not an expert. Are there things in there that make me kind of wonder or scratch my head? Yeah, sure. The potential of the move-counter move just is always, it's frustrating as the attacker when that happens. It probably needs to happen for balance purposes to a certain degree, but if you're unlucky and it happens a lot, I think that could break the game. I just don't know. I only have my experience to go off of. I don't know if folks are seeing a similar issue or to what level that is. I mean, I suppose at some point you start running out of space. If you keep retreating one hex back, you start to, hit a point where your line gets extended by retreating one hex every time, and that might leave you open when you don't get the move counter move. So maybe I don't know. The more I'm thinking about it, maybe it's not a big deal. I'm just unsure, and how often am I going to play this game again to really prove that out? It may be quite a while before I play it again. Not because it's a bad game or that it's not something I'd like to return to. It's just, as you guys know, this has taken me 9 months to play the whole way through. It's going to be a while before I come back. I need to play other stuff. I need to get a palate cleanser for wargaming at the moment. But I'll say, I think the long game is certainly worth playing, but you have to be prepared to call it if it's not going, if someone does Barbarossa and is not doing very well in the early part of 1942, I think you got to call it, right, and say, okay, let's not drag this out for 30 more turns. If you're not going to win, there's no point, right? And the game does have rules for determining an early end of the game. But even you as the players, you should probably just look at that and say, yeah, I could maybe get 2 more victory points before this turn, as the rulebook states, but I don't think I'm going to be able to do it. Let's just call it. I think you ought to be able to do that because it's a long game. 44 turns is a long game. You could do it in a weekend. I'm sure if you and a buddy sat down and you spent 2 straight days just hammering it, you could probably get through 44 turns. And that's all you did all day was game. But I also think that the game still has a lot of value, even just for the scenarios. Like, yeah, it might be a lot of work to set up each scenario. You got to get all the counters and figure out what's in, what's out. It doesn't take that long. But I think like Barbarossa is fun, a fun scenario to set up and play out, to figure out how well you can do. I think Case Blue is really good. In fact, I've said it before, I'd recommend Case Blue as the scenario that new players should start with, not Barbarossa. Because again, as I've said in other videos long ago, the bar to hit is so high for a new player. You might not have very much fun failing at that, right? Case Blue provides a little more of an even, more open, and easier to manage scenario for new players. And I think that Case Blue is plenty fun, and I think that would work as the intro. If there's another edition of this or any recommendation that could be put on a box in the future, I would advise GMT or Ted to say, do Case Blue first. Just do Case Blue. Just do that. Do that first. Get a feel for the system. Then try Barbarossa. We didn't set up and play Citadel, but I feel Citadel is probably very similar to Case Blue in terms of having the game set up for you, and you've got opportunities for both sides to hit and attack and maneuver, with accounting for the fact that Citadel is really focused on the Kursk pocket as sort of a set piece of that scenario, very important part of it that you can't avoid. So it's got, similar to Case Blue, but it's got that special thing which makes it worthwhile. And then obviously Bagration being, the reverse Barbarossa, I guess, is one way to look at it. But that sort of end of war, Götterdämmerung style thing that you can play through. So I think each scenario has value, and maybe even if 2 experienced players who feel like maybe they don't have to be experienced players, but if 2 guys or gals, whoever's playing, two people want to take turns with the offensive stuff, right? Maybe if you've got a big long day of gaming, you're going to spend all day playing it. Maybe you do Barbarossa, right? And you let the Axis player do offensive fun. And then when that 7-turn scenario is over or whatever, you flip it and you set up Bagration for that 5-turn scenario, and you let the Soviet player get to be on offense, right? You don't necessarily have to play the whole thing. Maybe you play 2 scenarios and you pick those 2 because each player gets a chance to be heavily on the offensive, or you just play Case Blue, where again both players have some opportunities to do stuff. There's a lot of potential here. There's a lot of good gameplay here. I think ultimately I'm walking away, I'm glad I'm done. Finally, we finished it. Great, that's awesome. But I'm feeling good leaving it. I was excited at the end, getting through it all. I've had a good time with it. I have this map ingrained into my brain now, having looked at it for so long. So overall, I'm walking away. This has been a lot of fun. Major undertaking on my part. Not sure I'm going to do something quite like this again, unless it's World in Flames on camera. But plenty of cool stuff here. So. Thanks for watching the Post-Mortem, guys. If you have any thoughts, your own Post-Mortem or lessons learned thoughts on the video series that I've done here across all these turns and hours of gameplay, let me know. Want to continue the discussion and the conversation. Really appreciate folks reaching out and commenting and having watched all these videos. If you stuck the whole way through, you get the Steve ribbon of commitment or something. We'll take a lot of what we talked about here into the review in the next video. Again, not exactly sure when that's going to come out. I need some prep time for that, but I do want to get a review out. I want to summarize some of what I rambled on here and really talk about some objective thoughts around the components and just the game in general. So we'll see you in that video, guys. Thanks for watching. take care, keep on gaming, and yeah, catch you later.